to another episode of The Molten Truth. I'm your host, Zoe Michaels, and we have a special treat in store today. It's not often you meet someone who has as much experience as our guest today. Appears to be a world traveler, has written many books, some exciting stuff just based on the book titles. And I am really looking forward to getting to know more about our guests. So, Humphrey, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I want people to be as excited about this conversation as I am. And if they're anything like me, they probably are going to want to look at your website because that's the first thing I would be doing. So, can we tell them what your website is?
Yes, I think my name is up on the screen. Humphrey Hawksley. That's Hawksley. Actually, it's www.humphreyhawksley.com. If you just Google Humphrey Hawksley, it tends to come up pretty much on the top of that because it's such a weird name, that it's not like John Smith or Zoe Michaels that can get lost somewhere. So Humphrey Hawksley, that gets to the website, and then there are sections in it. So there's my diary, which is the sort of podcast like this I do, and the moderating of events. There's my journalism. There's the books, which have got different genres, nonfiction, fiction, thrillers, and all the rest of it. And also a bit of sort of. I do a travel and food blog as well, because what you find, Zoe, is if you're in my trade and you go somewhere and you do a very serious piece about whether China or whether something, and then you do a blog about the Chinese restaurant that you had stuff within Xiamen or Peking or Beijing or something like that, you'll get 1,000 hits on the food blog and one hit on the with a China blog. So that's why I do a bit of that.
That's probably what I'm doing wrong. I need to start blogging about Cincinnati or some other places I've visited.
You do that. We can talk about restaurants and hotels and holidays here, and you never know what happens.
Well, one thing that's certainly universal, everybody loves food, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Food and scenery, you can never go wrong with those.
yeah.
But it's interesting because that was one of the first things that caught my attention when I went to your website. I had Googled you, got to your website, and went, wow, look at, he worked for BBC. He has books, and ooh, what's this about Alaska? So, of course, I clicked on the link about Alaska because how cool is that?
Well, Alaska is because the current book series I do, it's called the Ray Kozena series, and that is it's just been republished and recovered and everything, and that's about and I wrote the first one I think back in 2019 or something, and that came from a BBC trip I was doing to the US-Russian border. Now, at the time, Russian-American relations ebbs and flows, goes up and down, and the rest of it. And something bad was Crimea was going. Putin had just invaded Crimea at that time, and I thought I better go and look at this border because nobody really knew much about it. And when I checked it out, I knew why, because it's in the middle of nowhere. It's some of the most hostile, cold, barren, remote places in the world. Barely anybody lives there. And the mainland of Russia and America is separated by about 55 miles. But, and this was what attracted me, in the middle of that 55 miles, there are two islands. And one is an American native Alaskan island with about 80 villages on it. No roads, no hotels, no restaurants, no food blogs. I mean, it was just there. Then on the other side is a Russian military base. And there's less than 3 miles between the two of them. And I said, I've got to get to this place. So I persuaded the BBC to, it is quite tricky, but I got that. And it's you have to go, you fly into Anchorage, then you have to fly to Nome, which is the main sort of old gold rush town on the west coast there. And then I had to charter a helicopter that went into Little Diomede Island. And I chartered it to do a sort of overnight stay, and it was meant to come pick me up the next morning. But out there, the weather is unpredictable. And I ended up staying 10 days or more until the fog lifted and the helicopter could get back in. So we'd done the filming and we got the basic story and we'd done all that sort of stuff. So what do you do? And I sat there looking at Russia. And what sort of was fascinating about this border is there were no flags on either side. There was no border post. There were no boys in the water saying, this is Russia, this is America. Um, Everybody sort of knew that this was the border and that it was a hostile border, because if you went across the other side, you'd get thrown into jail and maybe not come out again. But then on the island itself, there was no police, no military, no border guards or anything. It was less than 100, about 80 villagers lived there, and that was it. And in my sort of mind as a correspondent, I've been all over these sort of war zone places and that sort of thing. I thought, okay, so supposing a fleet of Russian helicopters just suddenly came over the brow of the hill and came to this island, they could take it just like that. And I thought, what would happen if they did? And I got a number of different answers when I went back to Washington, and the Pentagon people asked them that. I'll mention that in a second. But then, when I got back to London, I started writing the story, and of course, no story idea actually survives contact with the written word. So,
Right.
I had the thing and I stuck. But that, and I had, these sort of thriller books, Tom Clancy type books, they always have this sort of Harvard, West Point educated hero that's going in to save the world. And I sort of plucked one out of my imagination, I don't know, what do you call him, Brad Pitt or something, so some sort of name like that. And not Brad Pitt, you know what I mean.
I know what
And
you mean. Yeah.
and and then I thought, I'm completely nuts here, because on the island itself, I mean, these people on the island, they are the most rugged. They know about survival. They can read the weather like we scroll our phones. They look at a bird and see which direction it's flying and know what the wind's going to be doing. They can read ice. They can understand all of these things, and they can read people, because it's all about survival and who you're with and that. And two or three of the people in on the island I'd met had actually been serving in Iraq and Afghanistan and that sort of thing and come back. And I thought, well, hold on a second, you stupid. This one of these guys is going to be the hero of my series.
Yeah.
And that was Ray Kozena. That's the name of the series. And I did it as a standalone thriller. And actually, interesting, when I got back to Washington, talked to all these sort of intelligence defense guys, I said, what would happen if Russia did that? Half of them said, well, it would never do that because it would know the consequences. And the other half said, oh, we just let it go. just what would it matter? Not whether, so there was no unified view on that. Anyway, so that was to be a standalone. And then, it was successful. And, I signed another contract with the publisher, another contract. I've done four, and I've just finished the fifth.
Amazing. So what you viewed as a standalone book became a series just because
Yeah.
there was interest in it.
Yeah, it was interest in it, and I'm glad it became. I'm glad there were other ones, because as far as I'm aware, there's no sort of thriller where the protagonist is set in that remote location, and not much is written about that remote location. And another element is that the Arctic itself recently, ever since America said it wanted to invade Greenland, the Arctic itself has become a hot topic. So,
Mm.
so the Ray Kozena series, fingers crossed, is sort of slotting into that whole thing. You never know how the world's going to unfold.
Yeah, true.
Yeah,
Just serendipitous timing, maybe.
who knows? Who knows? But I enjoy doing it, and I learn a lot when I do it. So I've got a big trip to Greenland in next month or so, and I was up in Alaska in December doing a bit of research there. Which is, have you been to Alaska, Zoe?
Not yet. It's funny because I lived in Oregon for a time, and it would have been so easy to have caught a plane and gone even just for a weekend, and I didn't do it.
Yeah.
And now I regret that because here I am on the other side of the states, where it's like, oh, now I really have to make the effort.
Yeah. It's just this weird place, and of course, in it's in 1867, America bought it from Russia for seven
Yes,
million dollars. $7 million
super
doesn't even buy you an
tall.
apartment in New York now. But bought it there, and it's absolutely vast. And there's a sort of thing there when you're the taxi driver, whoever you're with. Um, you ask them how long they've been in Alaska or what generation are they, and a lot of the people there are retired military. They because it's a big military base up there. They leave there and they stay in Alaska because it's got a sort of atmosphere about it that you don't get on they call it the lower 48 and the upper 48. Yeah.
Absolutely. Part of me wonders if I dare ever go to Alaska because I am candy for mosquitoes, and I understand there are more mosquitoes in Alaska than probably in the lower 48.
Oh. I actually that's interesting because well, when it was cold, because I was minus 20 or something, no mosquitoes. So if
That
you
is
wrap up
nice.
well and go there, in the summer, I don't know what in the summer. I was there in July. July didn't need no mosquitoes. No. You're going to get more mosquitoes in Kenya when you go to Kenya, or when you go to Johannesburg, you'll get mosquitoes.
Good to know. Now, are you still working with the BBC, or are you kind of retired from that and purely an author? Where are you at in your life
I
at this
am. I
point?
do not. I'm off the BBC payroll, so I am for hire on that. Not, but no, I'm off the BBC payroll. I still contribute a bit to them. I do journalism. I host. I do two sort of podcast things. So I do one called Democracy Forum. It's
Okay.
not a podcast, it's more like a debate webinar. It's called the Democracy Forum Debates. So the one we're doing in a couple of days' time is about India's pivot towards China and Russia and pivot away from America. We did one about artificial intelligence, critical minerals. It's all sort of this heavy political stuff I said that you don't get any clicks on, and I'm sure if I did a food podcast. The other one I did, which you and I might have more common ground on, is one called Care Vision's Professional Talk. And once a month, we get a professional who is an expert in mainly child and young adult trauma and care to, to see how you can, if you get a child from an abused home or, bad parents or something like that, and they have to go into care or they have to be spotted, how do you move them through into adulthood and then out the other end so that they're not living that trauma all the time?
Right.
And I find it fascinating because one clear thing that comes out of it is that if you have somebody in a care situation, you like it in a children's home or something, you have to have therapeutic care in there, holistic care, because a child, you can have somebody that comes in and might, play the football game with them, clean them up, feed them, and all the rest of it. That's what I call the shift workers. But amongst all that, the child or the adolescent needs a mentor that they can trust and is going to be with them for a number of years.
Yeah.
Uh, and without that, and that is a parent, essentially, a parent figure. And if they can find that person and learn to trust that person, and we have to remember, if you come from a broken home when there's drug or physical abuse or all of that sort of stuff,
Trust is
your
key.
level of
Yeah.
trust as a child is really minimal. So you
Yes.
can, if you can move a child through that into adulthood, um, then that's a great success story. And I did a one, I think it was a couple of weeks ago. It was absolutely fascinating because two sisters. Um, they both had to go into a children's home. So they one was a little older than the other. One of them went through everything, did the schooling, got great exams, went to university, and she became the deputy head teacher of a school, and now she runs a mental health charity. The other one, drugs, alcohol, early death. And you just think, and both of they had pretty much the same thing. So
Isn't
it's
that
all up here,
amazing?
really, isn't it? Yeah. Sorry, I brought a
No,
depressing tone to your
no, not at
conversation.
all.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just, in my head, I'm thinking A Tale of Two Sisters. I mean, what kind of title and story you could
yeah,
develop from that?
yeah.
But
I mean, there were some detailed differences, but and the more I talk to these people, the more you sort of get to learn about this world. And I mean, of course, I think all of us, as a journalist, particularly, I've spent a lot of time with traumatized families, whether it's refugees from a war or whether it's domestic abuse or a crime or murder, in our own lives. You get that trauma that comes through,
true.
and ultimately, and this is again what has to be recognized, is it's not so much what happens to you, whether it's a
It's what you
car
do with it.
accident or a divorce or something. It's how you process it
Hmm.
in your mind. And if you don't process it well, it's never going to get out of the way. And if you do, or you have somebody help you process it, it's like breaking your leg and the guy that fixes it doesn't fix it right, and you
Right.
end up
So you
with a limp
still
for the rest of your
deal
life.
with the
Yeah,
damage,
yeah,
and you
yeah.
might break your leg again as a result
Yeah,
because it never healed right.
exactly. As a result of that, so I find this, and when I was reading your really interesting sort of profile of the show, when you were talking about,
Thank you for that
it's,
compliment.
it was lovely. It was great, and I thought for a moment, how we can do this, but then I thought, yeah, because I've met all these people, and I've come to my own conclusions on it, on what it is, because not I mean, often you get with victims, and again, I'll say this, when I've been reporting abroad and that sort of thing, um, and you'll see somebody who's just had their family massacred by another group in the Middle East or something, or whatever. The victim seems to get into a mindset that their suffering is unique, and that is why they cannot see anybody else that's suffered, and we get this in politics too. That why is what's happening in, I don't want to put my foot in with what's happening in somewhere in the Middle East more important than what's happening in, say, Sudan, in Africa or something, where million, or what happened in Cambodia is different to this, that, and the other. Each one prioritizes their own suffering, and that's a really bad mindset,
I
because it's
agree
much
with you.
better if you can say, okay, I've had a dreadful time. I've lost an arm and I've got this disease, and my family's left me, or whatever it is. But this person over here, they're having a dreadful time too,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
we get through it together. So it's this idea of trauma and suffering it's a really interesting one. So you've got me off it. You've got me on it. I'll stop now.
No, you're fine. But it's interesting the terminology that we use because I have some very strong opinions about that. Um, when I think of a victim, I think of someone who has given up. They've laid down. They live in that little bubble of I'm
Yeah,
a victim.
yeah,
They've not healed. They've not searched for ways to heal.
yeah.
And so I think of a victim and I think of a survivor. And the survivor
Right.
has searched out ways and has found a way to heal and move forward and stepped out to help others recognizing
Yes.
that. So to me, those are two, they're related, but they're very different ends of the spectrum.
And how do you move someone from being a victim mindset to survivor mindset?
Yeah. I think it has to come within themselves, to be
Yeah,
honest.
yeah. Hmm.
You know, I went through a little bit of, we're going to call it self inflicted trauma. And that's why I have very strong opinions about it. Um, and I stumbled on the way to heal myself, very happy couple stumblings into, oh, here's some information that's going to help me heal, and here's some information that's going to help me heal. It was just being in the right place at the right time, hearing the right thing, and letting my curiosity drive me.
Yes,
Um, you know,
yes.
someone had,
Curiosity is really important, isn't it?
it's super important because that's
Absolutely.
how discoveries are made.
Yeah. And there are so many people, that traumatized, particularly. I mean, in my professional work, I'm not talking personal. That the Iraqis or from Afghanistan or something like that, and
Right.
you cannot have a conversation that's outside their suffering.
Yeah.
You can, and even if you do say, "Oh, there's Taylor Swift is playing tonight. Do you want to go and see them?" Or let's go fishing down on this beautiful river. Within seconds, it's pulled back
Yeah.
to this thing,
Right.
and I think but another element that interests me in this, because I've written some books on this as well, is the what I would call a national victimhood or national sense of suffering, um,
Yes.
and the ideas of what we've got with all this stuff going on at the moment. Is Russia. Russia feels that it's a victim, so it's doing what it's doing.
It's lashing
Nazi
out.
Germany felt it was a victim in the 1930s, so it's doing what it's
Yes.
doing. And
Spot on.
yeah, and I don't know whether that's been diagnosed or not.
But you know, it's interesting that you look at it that point, because it really is kind of the case. You know, you we're going to take it out of the national realm and put it to like two kids, two squabbling
Yeah,
kids. You know, he hit me, so now I've got to hit him back harder. Oh, you
hmm
hit me, I can't forgive you, so I'm going to hit you back harder. Suddenly, you've got this whole giant fight.
yeah,
Same thing in that other realm, right? They never
yeah,
forgive. They never look for ways to heal, and
yeah.
so they let it seethe, and history repeats itself.
Yes, and I mean, there's this thing that I've heard in so many war rooms or war games. Such and such a country does, and in these war games they're usually fictitious. So such and
Mm-hmm.
such a country has done this, therefore we must respond. And
Right.
I'm crying, no, you don't.
Right.
You don't have to respond.
No.
And quite interestingly, when I was in Alaska recently, I found out that during the Cold War,
Mm-hmm.
the Russians had shot down quite a number of American planes. I mean, like half a dozen or a dozen or so. America had not responded because it didn't want to escalate anything. He didn't particularly want to get out into the public thing. It had just absorbed the hit. So you have one thing in public, America's big enough actually not to respond to something like that. And then you have the other thing saying we have to respond proportionately. That's the legal word, is it? You have to give a
Right.
proportionate response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which, of course, if the average American, if they've watched any movie, where there's like a presidential type of character, they've seen that proportional response.
Yeah.
Um, I think of that movie, The American President. That there was the prime example in that movie where they'd opened that base, they got hit, and he's like, "Well, what's the proportional response? And we're going to hit it while the janitor's working."
That's right. Yes, and
You know?
you can't hit it during rush hour when everybody's going getting their sandwiches or their lunch or
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah,
Exactly. We're going to hit the innocent guy, not the guys who actually caused that problem.
but I think we're touching on something quite interesting here, because you have a lot of experience in this sort of personal trauma, whatever you want to call it, because
Yeah.
and a lot of your conversations are about that. I have that, and then I've also sort of recognized it in nations,
Hmm.
and and the and I think you were quite right. You put it down to two kids,
It
you know,
really is.
two kids there. And I did a series of books before I did the Ray Kozena series. It was called a Future History series.
Hmm.
And I did them 20 plus years ago now. One was called Dragon Strike, which was which was about America and China having a war. And then the other one was called Dragon Fire, which was India, Pakistan, and China. And when that came out, it was outselling Harry Potter in India. So that was a thing. And then the last one was called the Third World War. And one of the things that I did with the great editor that first commissioned them, he said, don't do too much on personal characters. We want to see what the countries are, because the nations are characters themselves.
True.
And we've just reissued the series, and Third World War came out in 2003 or 4 originally, so it's 20 years old. Is it 20? 22 years old. And those nations in it, the main nations are China, Russia, India, and the US, and the UK. I have to put a bit of the UK in. But those nations are acting in the same way that they're acting today.
Yeah.
It is what they are. It's what their culture is, whether it's religion or history or the way they eat or how they live or whatever. Countries have always acted in a certain way, and that's what they do. And this is why when people talk about the present American administration, I said no. You might talk about one guy, but actually, what that guy is representing is that nation at that particular point in time.
It's
You know,
true.
and then another guy, somebody else is going to come in 10 years from now and will temper down everything a bit, and then it'll go up again, down again, up again. We've had 7 prime ministers in 10 years or something in Britain, so I know what I'm talking about when it comes to this sort of thing.
I would say so. Absolutely. Now, do you actually live in Britain, or are you here in the States? Am I allowed to ask that? Feel free to
Yeah,
tell me. That's none of my
I'm
business.
I'm talking to you from London.
Okay. Okay.
I'm
I
talking.
wasn't sure.
Yeah, I'm talking to you from London, where the newspapers are full of our royal family at the moment,
Oh
and
yes.
all of that sort of stuff. And I've lived in London and on the east coast of England for all my, apart from when I was in Asia. So I was my first posting for the BBC was in Sri Lanka. There was a Tamil civil war going on there in Sri Lanka at the time, and that was in the late 80s. And I went out to cover that, and that taught me something about government and democracy. In that, and then I flipped those thoughts right through to when I went to cover Iraq and Afghanistan and all that sort of thing. And that's this. So is that when we, the British, we decolonize like instantly. We want to do this instant stuff like we did in Iraq. We want to win in there an instant. So so instantly we decolonize, and then we put in this thing that's called democracy, and people vote. But in Sri Lanka, they had a majority Sinhalese population, they were Buddhist Sinhalese, and a minority Tamil Hindu population. And at that stage of the sort of government development, people vote by religion and ethnicity. And I think we get that less here. You get it a bit in the States when you talk about the Hispanic vote and the black vote and the whatever vote. But there it's absolute. So, so we handed over a system whereby one group would become the dominant group. That was the Buddhist Sinhalese. They would always run the government. The Tamils would never be able to do anything about that. And then, of course, in politics, the more extreme a person is, the more popular they tend to become. So the more extreme the Sinhala Buddhist people were, was they had to be extreme against the Tamil population. And then the Tamils rebelled and started blowing up, and that war lasted 25 years.
Yeah.
25 years, and you think, how on earth? Why on earth did we do it like that? You
Right.
know. And I went from there to the Philippines. There was a dictator there called Ferdinand Marcos, and he had just been overthrown. And it was interesting because you go around talking to people. I was very close to the Americans there because the Philippines is sort of a former American colony and that sort of thing. And there was this idea that this panoply of fair and wonderful institutions would just float down from heaven and be there. so the judiciary would work, would be fair and work, and the fire brigade would come, and when you call the police, they'd come, and they would, you wouldn't have to give them any money and all of that sort of thing. I don't know where this idea came from, and of course it didn't work. And I covered um, 7 coups d'états. That's the military rising up against the government there. And this was coups d'états when people had guns and people died and all of that sort of thing there. And I tracked down one of the coup leaders there. Um, he was a there were 2 of them. There was one guy called Red Kapunen, and he was an Air Force guy. He flew the lead helicopter in the film Apocalypse Now, in that very famous scene where they're playing the Ride of the Valkyries, and they land, and the late great Robert Duvall is on the beach there saying, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." And the guy that flew that helicopter was the same guy that carried out that flew the helicopter for the coups in there. These are really bright young kids I call them. And then another one was a really dashing young colonel, and he would parachute on special forces operation with a snake in his pocket. And he did that
Okay.
because I think it's a sort of legend, a snake. I never could quite work out why. But there was, at the time that I was there, the young female war correspondents were all swooning over him because he was this absolutely sort of dashing young figure. And so that was 7 coups d'états, and still the Philippines is all over the place. The son of the dictator that was overthrown is now the president, and he's called Ferdinand Marcos too, and the corruption is rife, and this is rife, and that is rife, and that's 25, 30 years later or whatever. And
Yeah.
and this idea that I sort of saying this because there's all this stuff going on about Iran at the moment, and these things, I get so angry because you can't just strip away one thing, one leader or something, and expect everything to be fine. It just doesn't work. Like they don't have like the US has got, or like we've got, is the president goes, you've got the vice president, then you've got the speaker of the house, and all the rest of it. You don't get that over there, and you don't quite know what happens in these places except war breaks out.
True.
Sorry, well, I
You
got
make a
diverted from what we were
good
talking about.
point. No, no, it's fine. But I had not given it any kind of serious consideration until you said it. But you're very right that it's a reflection of the collective people. It's the collective personality represented by one person who's their leader. Um, 9 times out of 10, I
Mm.
think that's true. There may be the exception, as there is with everything, but it's an interesting point.
Yeah, I think if you look at um, I mean, if you look at the Iraq and Afghan wars, which I think are the latest ones, Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi leader, he understood that country absolutely, and that's why he managed to run it for so long. And whilst he was running it, he was pretty brutal to people that, challenged him. But he also built roads and educated people and allowed women a certain. I'll tell you I'll tell you this story, although it's not a great story. When we were doing the Iraq thing, there was a what we call a fixer, a young local producer, who was working with me. Actually, she was working with me before the invasion when Saddam was in power, and she was a translator, and she would know people. And she took me to university and all that down in the southern city of Basra. And she also wanted to be a doctor. So we sat one day over a cup of coffee, and I was sort of checking her English as she was filling in the form to become a doctor, and she was wanted to go to Baghdad University to be the doctor. Then the invasion came, and then the next thing, I saw her once again, and then she vanished, and I went round to her house, and it's in a compound, and I knocked on the door, and she opened it, and she was covered from head to toe, and she said, "You must never come here again." And
Oh, it
she
was
was not allowed
close.
to be a doctor.
She was. Oh,
She was
wow.
completely covered. And I said, "Are you okay?" And she flipped back her sort of
Hood
bit of cloth to
or
show
mask.
bruises and everything down her.
Ooh,
And I said, "What can I do?" He said, "You can't do anything. Just go away. Never see me again. Otherwise, it'll just get worse." And this was
that is
a
awful.
wonderful, bright, intelligent woman, and that's what we did by invading,
Yeah,
essentially. You know,
yeah.
and
Worse repercussions.
and then, yeah, we sort of talk about. Talk about. I think it's this idea of trauma that got me onto that. But you've got to think of the consequences of what we as nations have done on other parts
Yeah,
in other sides of the world.
so true. So, in your capacity with your podcast, have you ever run into, and that's why if I look distracted, I was looking, trying to remember the name of this lady. There was an author by name of Allison McBain. Have you run into her? That
No, I
name ring
don't
any
think so.
bells? She is
No, but
fascinating.
ring the bells for me.
Yeah. So if you haven't spoken with her yet, I think you should because I think you'll enjoy talking with her. Um, we did a podcast in my first season, aired back in September. She had written a book about what if the United States had never been colonized by England? What if it had been colonized
Oh,
by China? And so she does this whole alternate universe with her book.
brilliant,
And I'm
brilliant. Yeah,
thinking that you would really enjoy speaking with her on one of your podcasts. She shares the
I
same
would very much.
publicist. But,
Yeah,
as you were
yeah,
talking, and especially about, these different situations with the politics, I thought, I couldn't help but
yeah,
think about her and her work and just her
yeah,
thoughts on how the motivation for colonization would have been different, and maybe, of course, as a result, future history would have come out
yeah.
differently. Um,
I must get that. So she did a book of what if the US had been colonized by China and not Britain.
ex- exactly. I forget the name of her book. Let me see if I can find it here. But
I'll find it. No, no, I'll look that up straight away and I'll get that because I mean that's a great concept. It's brilliant.
right,
And
yeah, it was just like,
and the
wow, I never would have thought of it.
no, I mean the common one is what if the Mayflower had landed somewhere down in Buenos Aires and the Spanish and the Portuguese had gone up to the north, would Latin America now be the powerhouse
Wouldn't
or
that be
not?
something?
And I think that was, I think somebody's done that, or I've had a number of discussions about it. But I mean, that would be a sort of thing as to, is it the Protestant pilgrim wasp, whatever it is, ethic that seeps in there against the more romantic, Mediterranean, more relaxed manana thing that went down in the tango and all the rest of it that went down into Argentina and Brazil.
Right. Or just the very mindset, that whole, this is me remembering like sixth grade, social studies type of things, but the whole concept of manifest destiny. That they populated the United States and they had to keep pushing west because that was what they had to do. It was under that heading of manifest destiny. Whereas, you know, another culture possibly might have maybe been more friendly with the Native American Indians. They would have
Yeah,
respected boundaries and worked around them. And, it's just interesting to imagine the different, we're going to go back to personalities of different
yeah.
individual countries and how they might have
Mm.
worked differently with the indigenous peoples.
That's a very interesting one actually, and I'm just trying. As you were thinking, I was thinking about that because um, the British and the French were the main pushing colonizers, and we were pretty, and the French were not great either. The Spanish were absolutely horrendous, as were the Portuguese. They just
Yeah.
slaughtered everybody. And then came the Germans. The Belgians were dreadful because they had Zaire, which is now the Congo, and the King
Mm.
Leopold just declared it his own fiefdom and did what he wanted there. That was absolutely horrible. I guess if the Norwegians or the Nordic countries had been involved, they would possibly, I don't know, have been a little bit more um, sort of sensitive to that kind of thing. But there's a great difference between you talk about manifest destiny, the American mindset compared to the British mindset,
Right.
because the American mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, because you're sitting right there in the middle of it, and I'm sitting in Britain. The the American mindset is the individual is
Hmm.
responsible for their own destiny,
Right.
and there is a sense there that the more the government is involved in your life, the more of a failure you are. Actually, you want to be completely free of the government in what you're doing. Um,
I think that's a
in
fair
Britain,
statement.
yeah, it would. I mean, I think that a number of interviews I've done with sort of people that the people we're talking about that have fallen on hard times and trying to get out of them around America. There's always this thing: is I've got to get the government out of my life. I mean, that was the sort of thing. And then there's you see there's certain things in the states that I would did a panel in Washington some years back, and there was a senator, Republican Trump senator, sitting next to me. Well, he was a Congress. I don't think he was a senator, sitting next to me. And I said, Congressman, there's about 4 or 5 things that we shouldn't even begin to talk about. And he said to me, "Oh well, it's a freewheeling conversation. Talk about it." I said, "No, because they won't go anywhere." I said, "What are they?" And I said, "Well, I was raised in Britain and in Europe, and raised in a complete different way to what you were raised." And he was still a bit flummoxed. And I said, we should not discuss gun control. We should not discuss social welfare. We should not discuss abortion. There was a couple of, healthcare. We shouldn't discuss healthcare. There was another one and then at the end of the panel, there was a guy from China, a professor from China was actually on the panel. It was obviously a time when they were more free to talk than that. And I looked across to him, and he sort of eyed me and overheard what he was saying. And then I said, and we shouldn't discuss democracy either, because Professor so and so over there was raised in an authoritarian environment, so he wouldn't necessarily understand what we are doing in Europe or what you're doing. And you're not going to change somebody's mind
Hmm.
in a half-hour debate on that.
No.
You're not going to change the mind, and you're not going to necessarily be able to argue the points,
Right.
or win over the audience, because it depends where you are. If you're in Europe, the audience is going to be a one. If you're in America, particularly probably where you are, I don't know, you're on the gun control thing, you're going to be on another thing. And then if you're in China, you're going to be on in another viewpoint.
It's amazing to me to think that ultimately the human family, we're all related, but parts of the family are just so different. They think differently, their viewpoints are just collectively so different, but we all kind of we came from the same place. And it's so amazing to me that it's so divided despite really being part of the same family.
The families are divided, aren't they?
They are up to a point,
Yes.
but you still have certain
Yeah.
things in common. I think of cousins I don't particularly like, but
Yeah.
there are certain things that we still hold in common that will be the bridge that helps us unite in certain situations. It's
Yes.
just a
But then
fascinating thing to me.
it is fascinating. But then there's the Cain and Abel story, isn't there? Where brother kills brother,
True.
and the sibling rivalry in that. I mean, there is a great. Now you got me thinking again, Zoe. You can't do this to me. You throw out these things, and and you completely change my mind in seconds.
Just asking questions. It's what I do.
But actually, having said that, I got to say, the I've been to a few funerals actually nowadays where there's been unresolved issues
Yeah.
between child and parent or siblings, and one of them is gone, and you can tell the deep, deep regret that that person has for not squaring things off before, because you know the yeah, and I think it's very important to. I mean, for my family, I'm reaching out all the time to them, and they're reaching out to me. And I would say that if we were not brothers or whatever and siblings, if we'd met each other, you know, we probably wouldn't be friends because we have
Yeah.
complete different personalities. But family is so important, isn't it?
It really is. I think of myself as being probably the black sheep of my family, but at the end of the day, we would be there for each other. We may not agree on a lot of things, but on the core things, the things that are most important, when we have had to band together, we have banded together. And that
Yes,
holds true even for the cousins I don't care for so much. We still band together when we need to.
that's
So,
and actually, your thought there is that where do we all come from, and where do nations come from?
right.
You know,
Ultimately, there's that family bond too. Look at World War I. That was a squabble between family members if you get right down to it.
you, you're 100% right. It was. It wasn't, and that's when our royal family changed its name to Windsor. You know, so that it wasn't seen as a German family, which essentially it was at the time. Yeah,
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 yeah. It's an
yes, that was
interesting
a
thing when
family
you look a
squabble.
little deeper.
That was a family squabble that um, when basically it was squabbling over the family silver and who ran Europe. That's what the squabble was about. Um, and the people who wanted to run Europe, of course, survived in their big houses and everything, and the cannon fodder was sent to die.
Yep, exactly. So, how many innocent lives lost because the family couldn't get along when they could have just had themselves a big powwow with the family, duked it out among themselves, and no one else been the
Yeah.
wiser.
Well, I'd say that there was a book I did a few years back called Asian Waters, non-fiction book, and I still argue this. And I went through looking at all the various treaties that have been signed after wars, going through. So you start the Treaty of Westphalia back in the 17th century, Congress of Vienna in the 19th century, and then you had the Treaty of Versailles after the First World War. All of them kind of fell apart, and then you had the Second World War. And the Second World War produced the United Nations and what we're living with at the moment. And now we're getting into this dodgy period again. And I reckon that right now, since we know we're in a dodgy period, you get all the world leaders together, or as you know, not all of them, those that with a bit of power and money and that, sit them in a room and you say, up until now, all of these treaties, wars have ended and whatever. You've had to have the war before coming to the agreement. And
Mm-hmm.
I would be playing in a circular thing around, panoramic thing, all the destruction and suffering and whatever that comes from the nuclear weapons to the whatever's what I said. It is our job now to come up with an agreement that's going to last before the war starts.
Yeah,
Uh, I
absolutely.
I don't know if that will happen because
No, I
these
doubt it
treaties
very
tend,
much.
tend to be written by the victors, and you have to have a victor, and the victor comes from the battlefield.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
now even if I spell it out to you in that sort of way, I think how simple it is as to where we're heading at the moment.
yeah, yeah. I mean, my brother has occasionally commented that we will probably see World War III in our lifetime. I hope he's wrong,
Hmm.
but there are people who have that opinion. And me, I'm just a simple, very simple person. I think, you know what? I wish that they were not allowed to have people fight their battles for them. I wish that they could be locked in a room together, all the people who disagree, and they have to fight their own battle.
Yeah,
Because maybe they would think about it like, I don't want a bloody
yeah,
nose. Let's figure out how we can make this work.
yeah. And
But
leave us to
like I
do
said,
our
I'm a
podcast.
simple person.
Yeah, I think that's right, but I think that's probably what's going on at the moment. So, and there's nothing, and after covering these sort of political stuff for so long, I learned actually that you can have as many debates as you want. You can have as many papers written and universities and think tanks coming up with order. But at the end of the day, the decision on whether to do something or not is made by two or three people in a room, and they will not have read any of that stuff that's come on, and they do it because
None.
they think it's right, um, and they don't what I call backstory it. They don't, they do up to a point, but the fact that we keep doing this stuff, we went into Iraq, we went into Afghanistan, we went into Libya, we went into, none of those countries are any better, and now this whole thing's coming up with Iran again, and you think, ugh, what do they actually want to achieve by doing this?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's a whole big conversation you and I could go about. But yeah, at the end of the day, I just try to stay out of it and I just try to live my life because a friend of mine says it and I completely agree. There's no profit in war. War just begets more war, it begets more problems, and the world has enough problems without adding that.
Yeah, well, there we go. We've nailed that one, haven't we, Zoe? What a great!
I
I've got it
think
all right in
so.
my mind. It's all
Well,
nailed.
you and I have a good time. We can spend a lot of time talking in general, I think, and have probably not run out of things to talk about. But we are coming toward the close of our show. So let me ask you the random question from the previous guest. If you had to literally live in a book or a movie or even a TV series, what would you choose? What book or movie would you choose to literally live in that world?
Yellowstone.
Okay, interesting.
Yellowstone. Yeah, Kevin Costner's and Taylor Sheridan wrote it. And I just think that which character I would be, I've got no idea, but I just think that it's absolutely brilliant depiction of, it's Montana, but it's a sort of, what was that phrase you used, Zoe? Manifest destiny.
Yes.
That every character in that, they don't blame anybody else. They get on with it, with what's happening. They are in charge of their destiny. He's going to hold on to his land, against all the developers and whatever's is coming. He'll take on whoever it is to do it. And interestingly, he has a lot of empathy and cuts a deal with Rainwater, the native the native Indian chief there. So yeah, yeah, I would want to be in Yellowstone.
Very cool. I that would be an interesting thing to live in. Do
Okay,
you
what
have a
about you?
random question? Oh, for me?
Yeah,
I, you know, I love such a broad variety of things. So when I first considered that question, when Kimberly asked that, my mind went a hundred different directions. But I settled on Anne of Green Gables. I love the peace of that story, the peace of the
yeah,
environment, even among the people when they didn't agree with each other or did not really like what the other person did. It was still so polite in how they reacted and how they verbalized, and they still just lived their life. And I love that. So that's what I would live in.
yeah. And of course, other guy wants to be, and I should have said this actually, but I'll stick with this. He wants to be Jack Reacher in the
Yes.
childhood, doesn't he? So I should have pumped that, but I'll have to stick now with my original answer.
I liked your
No,
original answer. I think that was a good
I'm
one.
changing. I'm moderating my original. I want to be Jack Reacher in Yellowstone.
Okay, well, that's an interesting thought.
Yeah,
Is there a
see
book in
what
that for
happens with
you,
that.
maybe? Sounds like maybe a future story.
I don't know how we would do that one. Oh,
I have this idea myself for a book, and I'm not sure I'll do it, but I have this idea of like, what if you had like an old west story that spans into the World War II time frame, and you've got certain family members that are in, are without within a chain within this story. So you have these two old west gunslingers, one who's from the states, one who had been from Russia but relocated to the states, and they had been pitted against each other, but then they chose not to fight after all. But then their
right.
successive generations somehow wound up embroiled in whatever, and potentially fighting. But I have this like idea for that story that I am still trying to flesh out.
Oh, that'd be a that's a good story, but it'll take a lot of fleshing out.
It will. It's
Lot of
just
what I
broad strokes right now.
yeah, yeah. Well, what did I do? What did I do? The broad strokes have to survive contact with the written word. That's the
Yes, so true.
thing. Yeah.
But I thought about that the other day. I was listening to, the musician Tom Petty. Is that
Yes,
familiar?
yes.
That
Tom
sounds
Petty. I know.
familiar.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay, yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah,
he had
yeah.
this song I used to listen to when I was a teenager, and it was called Two Gunslingers. And that was
Okay.
kind of what spurred that idea for, ooh, what if I wrote this story about this, and then if I could like span it to the
Yeah,
future.
yeah.
So
Oh,
inspiration
that's yeah.
comes
No,
from
I
many
like that.
places.
There's a great what's it called? It was by an author called Terry Hayes. I think it's called the something of the locust, and he does it so cleverly because he actually takes you from the present to the future and then back again,
Mm.
and with all of that sort of stuff going on there, and um, and he wrote another book before that called I Am Pilgrim, which was a huge bestseller, and then he did this one, but and now and who is the remind me the author again who wrote about China colonizing the United States?
Ah, Allison McBain.
Alison McDane, right? I will have look her up straight away. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. McBain with a B. Buh.
Okay,
I know
McBain.
sometimes
Alison McBain.
it
Okay.
sounds differently when you say it, especially with the telephonics and such. But well, I've really enjoyed talking to you. I've just been having a ball. I hope our audience enjoyed it.
Well, you've changed my mind a number of times. You want a random question from me, don't you? Okay, the random
Yes, I
question
do.
the random question is what is the difference between dialogue, conversation, discussion, and debate?
What is the difference between dialogue, conversation, discussion, and debate?
Correct.
Discussion and debate. I sure hope our next person is a deep thinker, because I would love to hear this one answered by someone who's a deep thinker. I don't want to
Well,
jump
I
ahead
hope
and say, I don't know.
because somebody threw that out around the table a couple of nights ago, and we were talking about it for a couple of hours afterwards.
Yeah, yeah. I think that was a table full of some deep thinkers there, just to
Oh,
have
okay. You
that
better
to come
get
up with
it.
that
Well,
question in the first place.
you only have deep thinkers on your show, don't you?
I do sometimes. So hopefully our next person is a deep thinker, because I would love
Uh,
to hear like a really deep answer to that question.
will you let me know what you? I'll check it out, but let me know the nub of what they say,
Sounds good. Well, they would definitely
and
be
then
the
I'll
person
throw it back.
who's there you go. Their episode will air right after yours. So after we conclude our recording, I'll be sending you an email with the link to our session, along
Okay.
with the date that yours will go. But actually hang out afterwards. I have just a little more to say to you about that. But thank you
Okay.
so much for joining us. We really enjoyed
Lovely.
having Humphrey here
Thank
with
you so
us.
much. Yep.
You're
Brilliant.
welcome.
It
Um,
was fantastic.
and be sure to check out Humphrey's podcast, his website, his books. If it's been so entertaining talking with you, I can only imagine your books must be equally just wow, just enthralling. So I hope that our audience will check those out.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming.